Shannon Stubbs now joins us. She, of course, is the natural resources critic for the United Conservative Party and an Alberta MP who's been active on this file. And I'm kind of interested in knowing what she thinks about it. Ms. Stubbs, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Danielle. Thanks so much for having me.
I know that you guys at the federal level, and including your colleague in the Senate, Linda Frum, have done an immense amount of work trying to expose the issue of foreign funding. Do you think that the Premier's on the right track on this one?
Well, I'm really grateful that Premier Kenney is talking about this and that the Alberta government is going to do an inquiry that's going to result in details and in recommendations for action. And certainly, I think I can say that if Andrew Scheer and Conservatives are elected in October, we would look forward to working with the government on their findings and what federal measures can be taken. In addition to the things that Premier Kenney just said, people should know those are also the exact same groups that brought Minister Catherine McKenna to the U.S. shortly after the last election and gave her a big award and had a celebratory dinner in her honor. They also have numerous former activists from those groups working in the multiple senior levels in ministerial offices. And of course, there are sitting Liberal cabinet ministers themselves who have tweeted out messages in support of those groups, like, for example, calling for the veto of the Northern Gateway pipeline. So I think it's very valuable work.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. Is there anything that can be done at the federal level to advance this? I know that you've been trying to shine the light on, especially the amount of money that is going in during an election. To Jason Kenney's point, many of your colleagues were defeated in the last election by an active campaign by Lead Now. How do we know that's not going to happen again?
Yeah, I think there's two issues that we will have to take on. Now, first of all, of course, we've been calling on the Liberals to crack down on foreign influence and intervention in the elections. They're refusing to do that, and in fact, making it worse. But I think if we're elected in October, there's two issues related both to foreign intervention in general and also in resource projects specifically. One is to get at this flow of funding into these so-called charitable groups that are coming from other countries and then used not just for, obviously, the high-profile campaign against the oil sands, but, of course, as you know, it's been used against LNG, it's been used against mining, they're launching it against forestry, so it won't stop. It is an attack on the Canadian resource development in general for all the reasons that Premier Kenney outlined. But second of all is also related to the ramming through of Bill C-69. One of the aspects of that bill that we raised from day one was the removal of the standing test that used to exist when projects would be reviewed by the National Energy Board. Now, there's a lot of mythology from the left on this. There have historically always been the highest, most vigorous, most comprehensive level of consultation, input, and intervention in resource reviews in Canada for decades, well beyond any other major resource producer in the world. But the requirements of that test were that either you had to be locally impacted by the project, which means Canadian, or you had to have some sort of expertise or technical knowledge that would aid the board in making their independent science and evidence-based decision on measuring the project for their review. Well, the Liberals got rid of that. So now, as a result of them ramming through C-69, despite the requests of hundreds of amendments from 9 premiers in all 3 territories and senators, literally anyone in the world can participate and intervene in the review process for major Canadian resource projects under federal jurisdiction through the process that C-69 outlines. And now, of course, never mind all the other potential for what are actually provincial and municipal projects that now C-69 may expose. It's still uncertain, but may expose to federal review as well. So we've said we will immediately, of course, repeal C-69 and address that issue. So only Canadians or those with special expertise are giving input on all the merits and the issues related to a major resource review. And then we've got to get at this channel of funneling funding into Canada.
Well, because otherwise, with this existing process, this new process, that would make us even more of a target for federal intervention.
Yes, that's exactly right. And on the front end, right? So to bog down the process as much as possible, and for foreign interests then to potentially sway the decision making on major resource projects in Canada. I think most Canadians would find that totally unconscionable, and it was pretty galling to watch the Liberals just go ahead and ram that through regardless of the very reasonable amendments put forward by the Senate. The other thing is, one of the issues that they ignored was, and this is a claim Sohi makes all the time, and I hope people aren't falling for it. I know Calgarians and Albertans certainly aren't, but I hope we can spread this message across the country. You know, they try to argue that C-69 actually elevates the voices of Indigenous communities. Well, that's actually not true. One of the amendments from the Senate was explicitly to elevate and prioritize locally impacted Indigenous communities, precisely because they are often drowned out by these foreign-funded activist groups, and the Liberals rejected that amendment. So all locally impacted Canadians in general, and the voices of local Indigenous communities are now wide open to be overwhelmed by foreign-funded groups participating in the review processes on the front end.
I see you guys have just put out a press release. Justin Trudeau's vision for Canada natural resources. I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine that he even has a vision for natural resources, but I guess that's the kicker. It's your contention is it's to phase them out, because I can't see how it would be any other way. This is what I don't understand is they seem to act as if this is a better process that will facilitate more resource development. But anytime I talk to an industry leader, I'm hearing the exact opposite message. So what's the plan here?
Yes, well, that's exactly what I just find completely mind-boggling. I wasn't at the thing yesterday, but I hear he was in Calgary, I think yesterday, trying to tell Calgarians that he cares about the natural resources sector and oil and gas workers in particular. And it's just like they're in a twilight zone. They are making these claims about their legislation that, exactly as you said, fly in the face completely directly of what private sector proponents and energy and natural resource associations are saying very clearly. And they also then are asking all of us to suspend our knowledge of the facts and pretend that what has actually been happening under their government hasn't been happening, which is that nearly 200,000 oil and gas workers have been put out of work, more oil and gas projects lost under these guys than in any other time in the past 7 decades, $100 billion worth. You remember the Bank of Canada last year saying no new energy investment in Canada after 2019. That was before they even rammed through their bad bills. And in Calgary, just in the last 3 weeks, there have been hundreds more job layoffs, yet another company leaving the Canadian energy sector. Drilling is down. I know that banks are recalling their loans on the small and medium-sized drilling companies across Alberta. Like, what is actually happening is just not at all what Sohi and McKenna and the Prime Minister have the gall to run around claiming. Okay,
you've already talked about a few things that an Andrew Scheer government would do differently. And that's always the question is, what would you do differently? How would you get natural resources back on the front burner?
Well, we will repeal and replace C-69, and our first priority will be to restore confidence in investment in Canada. So it will be establishing a predictable, fair, certain, clear review process that is actually made independently. So we will remove all of the variety of political interventions that the Liberals have now inserted into the process, and ensure that decisions are evidence and fact and science based. And we'll repeal C-48 and a number of the other policies that they've implemented that are anti-energy, anti-resource signals to the private sector. You know, one of the things they slipped through right before Christmas was in a big omnibus bill, C-86. They've actually given themselves the unilateral power to do the same thing on every coast in Canada that they've just rammed through in C-48. So there will be a whole suite of measures we're going to have to take to restore predictability and certainty to the review process, and we'll have to do that sooner than later because of the catastrophic damage that the Liberals have caused. And, you know, we actually will proudly champion Canadian energy to the world. we believe, and we're the only federal party that believes that the world needs more Canadian energy, and that Canada is an environmental leader. And the way to reduce global emissions without costing Canadians more is to produce more Canadian energy and export it around the globe.
Well, you're such a great advocate and great voice for our industry. Thanks so much for the work you do. Appreciate it.